Flaherty, and you said we should ask them. And we're going to. That's why we sent them a subpoena this morning. We want them to come in and answer these questions about why the White House was attempting to censor American speech. With that, I recognize the gentleman from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleagues and friends from North Carolina and Florida are asking why we are talking about Donald Trump. The answer is because this subcommittee is called the Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. And because of that, the only evidence that we have here in front of us today about the weaponization of the federal government is from Ms. Troy, who has outlined in detail, and I'm sure she has more detail, how Donald Trump weaponized the federal government against his enemies and for his own political interests, and how he intends to do it again. So if we really want to talk about the weaponization of the federal government, we should talk about it, and that's Donald Trump. That's not this grand, crazy conspiracy of how the administration has utilized the social media companies against whom the First Amendment does not apply in order to suppress speech. This is actually the second hearing, I guess our quarterly hearing now, on the Twitter files with the same witnesses that we had. In the first hearing, I asked Chairman Jordan if he could identify any evidence of the government under the Biden administration actually censoring anyone through the social media companies. He pointed out to me an email on January 22nd from Clark Humphrey to flag a tweet that was from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as evidence. The problem was, and the chairman did not acknowledge this, the tweet was never taken down. How can you have censorship if the tweet was not taken down? And since March 9th, that hearing, this committee has had 29 witnesses.
With the gentleman you?
I will not only just because I have a bunch. You're the chairman, so I'm sure you'll respond after me. The 29 witnesses have testified, and every single one testified that the government never coerced, pressured, or threatened any social media company to remove any content. Mr. Taibbi, I introduced a letter that I led to X. Let's call it X now. That way we can know the difference between when Elon Musk took it over and before when it was Twitter. From November 21st. Have you read this?
No.
Well, do you think it would be problematic if X leaves up terrorist violence and propaganda in violation of the terms of service?
Terrorist violence or terrorist propaganda?
If it violates their terms of service, is it problematic?
Well, it depends on what the content is, but you know, they're a private company. They can do what they want with the content.
Aha! They're a private company and they can do what they want with the content. Do you think it's problematic that X would profit off of terrorist violence propaganda and content on their social media platform?
Well, first of all, just to go back to
No, just answer the question. I don't have time. Do you think it's a problem if they profit off of it?
Well, if the company makes money doing what it does, I don't necessarily see a problem with that.
Okay, interesting. So let me just move on because you said the biggest concern, sir, I'm sorry, you said the biggest concern that you had from the Twitter files was the systematic flags for social media companies. Now, the Stanford EIP that you're talking about, I'm sure you are aware, has documented that the social media platforms to whom they flagged potentially problematic tweets took action on only 35% of them, and only 13% of them were removed. Mr. Schellenberger, you said the biggest problem, and let me just ask you, Mr. Taibbi, real briefly, you would agree that these flags, that the systematic flags that you saw were flags for a violation of the terms of service of the social media company, is that right?
Sometimes, but sometimes in the case of the instances like Congressman Massey, they were actually true information.
Well, that may be the case, but the flag was for a violation of the terms of service.
It's for their interpretation of a violation.
And then the social media company has to determine whether or not it is actually a violation of their terms of service. And in 87% of those flags, they were not removed. Mr. Schellenberger, in brief time, you said that the censorship, the biggest problem you have is the censorship that you talk about is election interference. Do you agree that Russia used social media, including Twitter, to interfere in the 2016 presidential election?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, we've also briefly, if I may, Mr. Chairman, just have the extra time that my colleagues have had. You've talked about the Hunter Biden laptop and how the FBI knew it existed. You are aware, of course, that the laptop, so to speak, that was published in the New York Post was actually a hard drive that the New York Post admitted here was not authenticated as real. It was not the laptop the FBI had. You're aware of that, right?
It was the same contents.
How do you know?
Because it's the same, I mean, it's
You would have to
CBS News,
authenticate it to know
verified
it was the same contents. You have no idea. You
Are
know
you
hard drives can
suggesting that
be
it's a conspiracy?
manipulated.
Are you suggesting the New York Post could participate in a conspiracy to construct the contents of the Hunter Biden laptop?
No, sir. The problem is that hard drives can be manipulated by Rudy Giuliani or Russia.
But what's the evidence that happened?
Well, there is actual evidence of it, but the point is it's
There's
not
no
the
evidence
same
for
thing.
it, so you're engaging in a conspiracy
I'm glad
theory.
you agree with me, Mr. Schellenberger, that transparency is the most important thing. And my last question for you is, do you think it would be transparent if Hunter Biden came to this Congress and testified in a public hearing, and more transparent than if he testified privately?
I mean, literally, I've never thought about that. I have no idea.
You don't
I've
know?
literally never thought about
Is
that.
public testimony more
I mean, this is
transparent than
random
private testimony?
hour here. Are you familiar with the First
Mr.
Amendment?
Chairman, I
It
yield
says that
back.
the Congress shall take no action to abridge freedom of speech.
Yeah,
And that's what you just described.
Mr. Schellenberger, is 13% censorship still censorship?
Absolutely.
And the other 87% is what we call the chilling effect that the courts have long recognized that they engaged in.
You have
That
to-
is the problem.
There's a by the way, part of the operation, Congressman
Holy
Goldman,
cow.
part of the operation was to change the terms of service. So you see them constantly trying to change the terms of service. You see them, it was 35% of the URLs that were, this is according to EIP, were labeled removed or soft blocked. That's all forms of censorship. That censorship is not just removal.
Gentlelady
But
from-
65% were not. So how can the government be so coercive?
Does the
that
First
they were-
Amendment
I think
say
that's
that the
about par
government
for the
can
course
only-
on government
Does the
efficiency.
First Amendment say the government can censor
time of the
35%?
gentleman has
They're not
expired.
censoring. They're flagging in the social
Chair
media
recognizes
companies.
the
Under
Chair
coercion.
35% of a First
Chair-
Amendment, or?
Chair
It's not the
recognizes-
First Amendment. It's the terms of service, as you said, and they are
Oh, my.
flagging it for the social media companies to make their own decisions. That is not the First Amendment. That is the terms of service.
We have just seen the
Congressman, you're an attorney. You know that 4 federal judges have already ruled that.
And I know that it's on appeal in front of the Supreme Court right now.
that debate was very constructive.
that was
I
fun.
think that got to the heart of the issue. That's the problem right there.
That's-
The
that-
gentlelady
that's
from
right.
Wyoming is recognized for 5. We'll start with opening statements, then move into our witnesses. The chair now recognizes himself for an opening statement. Big government was colluding with big tech to censor Americans. That's the first thing we learned. But now it's big government colluding with big banks and big business to spy on everything Americans buy, every place they go, everything they do. Big government wants your financial data because it's full of sensitive information about you. Our investigation started when an FBI whistleblower, George Hill, came forward and talked to the committee. Mr. Hill was supervisory intelligence analyst at the FBI up in the Boston field office, told the committee that the FBI got information from Bank of America. Specifically, it received a list of any customer who made purchases in the Washington, D.C. area January 5th through 7th, 2021. The whistleblower's supervisor, special agent in charge of the Boston field office, Mr. Bonavolanta, corroborated Mr. Hill's testimony when he spoke to the committee. And so did Steve Jensen, the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Operations Section Chief. But it wasn't just purchase data around a specific date that the FBI got from Bank of America. That was actually also overlaid with any firearm purchase at any time. And how did the FBI get this information? They asked for it. In fact, you can see on the display on the screen here the email that was sent. The FBI told Bank of America, to recap our morning call, we are prepared to action immediately the following threshold: customers confirmed as transacting business in Washington, D.C. between these specific dates. So if you're in Washington, D.C., visiting your kids, maybe visiting your aunt, or maybe just a friend, the FBI wanted to know about every single purchase you made. And if you're a gun owner, look out, you're going to the top of the list. For simply exercising your Second Amendment right, you're on the FBI's target list. And never forget, the federal government got this information without any process. No warrant, and frankly, no notification. The bank didn't tell the customer that we're handing this information over to the FBI, the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world. Now, these FBI agents, Mr. Hill, Mr. Bonavolante, Mr. Jensen, they all said this was wrong and in fact sent the information back to FBI headquarters in DC. So that's how our investigation began. But since then, and we continue to investigate, but since then, we've learned that the financial surveillance was broader and there was actually a specific objective. The federal government is building profiles on the American people. And the profile isn't based on criminal conduct, it's based on political beliefs. And if you got the wrong political beliefs, well, you're potentially a domestic violent extremist. Now, how are they actually doing this? What are the mechanics of this? There's this entity we've discovered called the Domestic Security Alliance Council, kind of Orwellian in sound and title, the DSAC. And this is an entity where the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, works with 650 of the largest companies in the world. These companies have to do over $1 billion in revenue a year. They represent 2/3 of the gross domestic product of the United States economy. And they work through this controlled access portal. We'll put that on the screen here. What are they sharing in this secret portal? Well, we're not exactly sure because it's secret. But we do know that they share some information, share reports. And one of the reports we got, called a liaison information report, said this: any American who opposes firearm legislation, the easing of immigration restrictions, and COVID mandates is someone banks should be watching because, again, they might be an extremist. Now stop and think about that for a second. In other words, if you're against gun registration, you're for a secured border, you oppose lockdowns and vaccine mandates, you're a domestic violent extremist according to the FBI, and the government should get your data, should get your financial data. It actually gets worse. The federal government and banks also use what they call merchant category codes to flag Americans that shop at places like Bass Pro Shop and Cabela's. They flagged Americans who bought religious text. We can show you that one too. Because everybody knows if you want a secure border and you oppose COVID lockdowns, then you probably shop at Bass Pro Shops and you read your Bible, and of course all that makes you an extremist. Literally, that is the logic that you see displayed from the information we've been able to gather thus far in our investigation. Now remember, these are also the same folks who just a couple years ago told us if you're a parent showing up at a school board meeting, you're a terrorist. If you're a pro-life Catholic, you're an extremist. Now, of course, if you oppose lockdowns, vaccine mandates, want a secure border, don't want gun registration, you're in that category as well. This is scary where things are headed. We've seen the censorship. Now we see what's happening with big banks and big government relative to your financial data. Again, all this being done with no process, no warrant, no notification to the customer that the banks are actually supposed to serve. Big government's not supposed to use big tech to censor Americans, and big government shouldn't be working with big banks to target Americans for behavior that is legal and constitutional. And that's the concern. That's why we're having this hearing. We'll get to our guest here in a second. But with that, I would yield to the ranking member for an opening statement before we get to our witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing before us here today. I've heard your last name pronounced a couple of different ways today. How is it properly pronounced?
Seligman, thank you very much.
Seligman?
Seligman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Seligman. You stated you are an expert in constitutional law, correct?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. In your testimony, your written testimony, which was provided to us late last night, it says that, quote, and this is your writing, no government official ever threatened any social media platform with adverse action if a platform declined to moderate content flagged by the official or if a platform decided not to take an official's suggestions. Do you stand by your testimony?
Yes.
Okay. Now, a few minutes ago, just prior, you said that members of the legislative branch don't qualify for this particular statement, despite the fact that you said no government official ever. Does a representative in Congress constitute a government official?
Well, let me clarify my
Please do.
testimony from earlier. I don't think that legislative proposals that were brought by Republicans or Democrats constitute threats against social media platforms. That's true whether with respect to Section 230 reform. It's
Sure.
true with respect to antitrust enforcement.
So that would then lead us to the natural inclination to believe that you're talking about the executive branch, correct? Being government officials. So government officials like the Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Digital Strategy like Robert Flattery, or the White House Senior Advisor like Andrew Slavitt, or the NSC staffer Katie Colas, or the Deputy Assistant to the President, or the White House Digital Director, or the Press Secretary for the First Lady, or the NSC Director for Counterterrorism, the Chief of Staff for the Office of Digital Strategy, the Director of Strategic Communication and Engagement, the White House Associate Counsel, Associate Director for Communications, the Deputy Director of Digital Strategy, and the Strategic Director of Digital Communications. Those are government officials, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and what's so interesting is that all of these members of the executive branch, all of them have communications, thousands of emails between them and Twitter and Meta officials where they demand that posts be taken down and censored. I'll give you a couple of examples, and then we'll see if you still feel so strongly about your words. January 23rd, 3 days after the inauguration, at 1:04 a.m., Clark Humphrey of the White House emails Twitter and says, "We're flagging this post for you. Hey folks, wanted to flag this tweet, wondering if we can get moving on the process to have it taken down, ... ASAP. Then, on February 7th, an email exchange took place between Twitter and White House Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Digital Strategy, Rob Flattery, and asked for the steps that he could take to, quote, streamline the process for the White House's demands for Twitter censorship. Then 2 days later, on February 9th, 2021, he follows up again with Facebook with a more aggressive demand for more information, along with an accusation that would be repeated many times in the future, that Facebook was failing to censor speech on its platform, and it was causing, quote, political violence. Fast forward, you have March 15th, White House senior advisor then made an ominous statement threatening unspecified executive action against Facebook in retaliation for Facebook's perceived lack of cooperation with the White House's list of demands that have been documented and will be inserted into the record for this hearing on censorship of, quote, borderline content. The line that I think is particularly troubling is saying, internally, we have been considering our options on what to do about it. Do you consider that to be non-threatening?
I'm not familiar with the particular documents that you're referring to.
I just read you
but-
multiple examples.
Yes, and so I don't think that emphatic expressions of their concerns about the problem of misinformation is a threat. I don't.
So when President Biden says that social media companies are killing people, and then there is a direct line from the White House to the social media companies demanding posts be removed, going so far as to say there has to be a quick and devastating takedown, a published takedown, that is not a threat?
I don't believe so.
Wow.
I also don't believe it
Wow.
was a threat when President Trump
I
made
am-
comments about
I am
social
so glad
media
we
as
have
well.
this on the record. Again, my apologies to you, sir, for what you've had to endure here today, but with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, may I ask unanimous consent that the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, a member of the full committee, be permitted to sit on the dais. She's
Yeah.
not going to ask any questions.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Good day to everyone. Every day, the American people share with members of Congress, social media friends, family, and anyone who will listen that they live largely in fear for their future. When I scroll through my social media feeds, I see people worried they don't have job opportunities or job security the generation before them had, worried they don't have time, resources, or support to take care of sick parents or disabled relatives, worried they won't be able to afford to buy a home to call their own, worried they will not be able to see their kids, send their children to college, or simply provide for their children the way they were provided for. I see Americans are concerned. I see parents concerned that schools are becoming unsafe for their children. I see Americans are concerned that rights are being taken away. Americans concerned that their vote might be discounted or may not even be able to cast a vote. In the discussion of the weaponization of the federal government, the majority has acknowledged the fact, in this discussion of the weaponization of government, one of the things that I've requested that we look into is the IRS audits of working class people and people of color, which are far, far at a higher rate than millionaires and billionaires, or a discussion in a hearing of actions by the former President Donald Trump and what he has said he will do to weaponize our government if reelected. However, we're not having a hearing about those topics. We're not having discussions. Congress is not engaged in making any headway on those things that Americans are most concerned with. Today, we're having a hearing with witnesses on the Republican side, two of whom we've already heard from. In fact, this is the second hearing where Republicans have brought out repeat witnesses, the second hearing in a row. In preparation for the 2024 presidential election, Republicans on this committee want to entrench their theory of social media censorship, their unfounded accusation that social media companies are colluding with the government to censor conservative voices. There's no evidence of this collusion, and in fact, this committee has heard closed-door testimony from 29 witnesses who have said on the record, government, as well as social media individuals, that the alleged collusion and supposed censorship claimed by the committee Republicans has not taken place. But Republicans won't release that testimony, and they are not being honest with the American people. Because as they ramp up their own misinformation campaign before the 2024 election, they need free rein to elevate hate, to engage in voter suppression online, in addition to their normal in-person voter suppression tactics. This hearing suits political purposes. Republicans are holding the same hearing all over again for one simple reason. They want to distract from the actual threat of the weaponization of government on the American people. That is Donald Trump. In the past few months, Trump has said that he would reinstate the Muslim travel ban. In fact, his exact words were, "When I return to office, the travel ban is coming back even bigger than before and stronger than before." He has vowed to use the Department of Justice to investigate his political enemies. He has said that those who oppose him should be executed for treason. He has called his political opponents cockroaches, vermin, said that immigrants are poisoning American society. He has promised to use the Insurrection Act to mobilize the military against any protesters who speak out against him if he wins re-election. Those do not resonate as plans of a democratic leader. They sound like a dictator. They promise to be one who will silence his enemies and hold on to power at any cost. As the first branch of government, it is our job to be a check on that kind of undemocratic, unstable rhetoric in this republic. Donald Trump's statements are outrageous, and this committee and every member that serves on it should be outraged by them. And every American should be outraged at this committee by not having hearings on that. Many want to shield a man who, as many experts have identified, as spouting rhetoric cribbed from Nazi regime, calling his enemies cockroaches and vermin, saying that those who oppose him are poisoning the blood of America. and even calling for the execution of people who simply speak out against him. For 4 years, this man implemented loyalty tests, called for violence against his opponents, pardoned his friends, tried to illegally keep people out of the country because of their religious beliefs. He shoved children in cages, tried to illegally deploy the United States military to put down peaceful Black Lives Matter protests, and systematically dismantled the civil rights protections afforded to all Americans. And if he comes back, that will just be the start. That is why he has very clearly said what he would do over and over. Beyond loyalty tests, he plans to purge the government of all career officials and national security advisors who questions them. He plans to indict anyone who runs against him. He plans to silence protesters with the use of military force. He plans to make this country his, not the Americans' people. These plans will not just impact those who work in government. His plans are going to undermine the safety of every American when he appoints national security officials because they are loyal to him, not because they understand national security. They're going to impact people in areas that need support if he feels that they didn't vote against him. These plans are going to hurt men and women bravely serving in our military and law enforcement who are going to be forced to choose between carrying out fundamentally illegal unconstitutional orders and losing their job. Today we have Ms. Troy before us as a witness who has bravely spoken out to tell the world how Trump's White House had a culture of fear, how he had dictator-like tweets and statements, how he incited his followers to violence, and how he orchestrated detailed plans to spin his conspiracies into action by his followers. And she can say this with authority because she was there. She is a Republican who was in the Trump administration. When she says he means what he says, or that he will do everything in his power to make his dangerous promises come true, she speaks from experience. To use the words of the former United States Poet Laureate, Dr. Maya Angelou, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. And Ms. Troy, I want to apologize in advance for any attacks made against you today, which I'm sure will come, or afterwards. I want to thank you for your bravery coming forward and testifying today and speaking truth at all times, to be worried more about America than you are about winning. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back without objection. All of the